Hello, this is Kevin at Eagle Strong Voice. It's September 11th, 2023. And on this day I want to speak to you about the original 9/11 and the blood that still flows as we prepare once more to confront the killers of church, state, and big money. I was a boy of 17 when the slaughter began on September 11th, 1973. People just like me were rounded up by soldiers and bayoneted or shot or herded like animals in chains to the National Stadium in Santiago, Chile. Torture experts from Brazil and Washington, D.C. were flown into that place to rip apart the young men and women who had dared to try to reclaim their country and its wealth for all the people, especially the poorest of the poor. And after that CIA-funded military coup had finished overthrowing the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende, over 30,000 people had been murdered. That was 50 years ago today. Well, soon after the Chilean coup, I remember I was a young boy of 17 at the time. I remember lying on a sidewalk in downtown Vancouver as my fellow protesters poured ox blood all over me. And we watched as the blood flowed down Burrard Street to the shocked passersby. And my fellow protesters held aloft a banner and it said, "The blood of Chileans is on our hands if we don't stop the killers." Well, little did I know that the bloodbath was actually a lot closer to home and that it stained our Canadian hands more thoroughly. For across the street from where I lay stood Christchurch Anglican Cathedral, whose clergy were torturing and killing Indigenous children at that very moment in the domestic death camps they still like to call and falsely call Indian residential schools. And 25 years later, I would help occupy that church with survivors of that Canadian bloodbath, the Canadian genocide, and we would witness again to the slaughter of the innocent. For whether a half century ago or right now, the blood is still on our hands if we don't stop their killers. Well, that's the simple message that echoes down these past 50 years, and it's carried by the voices of the dead who struggle to speak and act through us. It's a voice we're going to carry this week into the Vancouver City Council meeting when we demand that the city government obeys international law and cancels all tax exemptions and licensing for the genocidal Catholic, Anglican, and United churches that killed over 60,000 Indigenous children right here. And it's a voice that will resound in those churches starting this week when we start reclaiming their buildings as reparations for over a century of their genocide. And it's a voice that will name the names of the men who murdered our friends Harriet Nahanni, William Coombs, and Bingo Dawson when we publicly indict the guilty and put them on trial at our West Coast Commonwealth Court of Justice that convenes on September 15th in Vancouver. Well, two of those voices speak strongly in me today, the voices of Peter Sanchez and Harriet Nahanni. They're separated by decades, but their message is the same. Peter was a Chilean refugee who had survived electric shock torture and saw his wife gang raped and murdered by Chilean soldiers right in front of him. And in one of our protests outside the U.S. consulate, he said to our crowd this: "Don't ever think you can get justice with words, because the rich and their paid stooges will ignore democracy and kill every one of us rather than give up a penny of their wealth. If you only make a revolution halfway, you're just digging your own graves. We Chileans have had to pay for not knowing that, and we paid with our own blood. Don't repeat our mistake." Harriet Nahanni said something similar. She was tortured by priests at a very young age and helped bury other children. And she said something that struck home from the pulpit of Holy Rosary Catholic Church when we occupied that church in March 2007. Harriet said, "I tried asking for justice from the church my whole life, but they ignored me. But now, after 60 years, they're listening because I'm doing more than asking. I'm standing here threatening their money. Talking doesn't do shit. You've got to hit them where it hurts and where it hurts them if you want things to change. That's why we're taking back these churches and ordering them off our land." And that order stands. Harriet was the first eyewitness to a residential school killing to go public, and she was also the first Native elder to evict these churches from her territory. She followed up with her eviction with action, as she demonstrated with me and others every time we occupied one of those churches. Harriet's actions were one of the reasons she was murdered in a Vancouver prison early in 2007, because she did more than talk. But we didn't let her death happen in vain. We picked up on her actions the next year, when in 2008, Squamish Elder Capilano evicted the genocidal Catholic, Anglican, and United churches from Vancouver and authorized me to be his legal agent and given the legal right of entry into these churches to enforce that eviction order. And when we started doing so that spring across Vancouver, not only did the police stand back and not stop us, but the Canadian government quickly responded by publicly acknowledging the genocide within a month after our Vancouver occupations began. In other words, direct action is what gets results. It always gets results. But that action has to be informed and aimed strategically at where our enemy is weak. That was one of the reasons we won that year, because we knew our enemy, and we struck at its Sunday church services where it held the thing it loved, its money and public image. We didn't merely protest and ask for something. We created justice on our terms by invading the enemy's territory and capturing what Sun Tzu called the chi, or vital energy of that enemy. We proved in practice that such methods work, but only if they're used by people who first feel an unquenchable outrage at the mass murder of children, and who have the will to fight and to never give up, never stop opposing and overcoming those crimes. To feel that kind of personal outrage commits you to a higher purpose that's greater than your own life, and that's what keeps you going. From that unwavering commitment comes all the courage and tenacity you'll never need. And that's what kept me going year after year over the last half century. It's what's kept me and others going against impossible odds, because I put my own interests on hold and done what's needed to struggle and overcome a monstrous child-killing enemy. And even 10 such devoted people who never give up can move mountains, as we've demonstrated time and again. Well, nowadays we have great need of people like that, for the genocide we exposed and confronted is reaching out to engulf our world and every one of us, especially here on Canada's west coast, which is the front line of the Vatican-funded Chinese takeover of North America and the entire Pacific Rim. Everything we do to evict the Catholic Church, especially from our communities, will stem that takeover. International law and Indigenous proclamations arm us to do so lawfully. You can read those proclamations at murderbydecree.com under ITCCS updates. Self-admitted and proven genocidal organizations like these churches have lost their right to operate, and their money and property can and must be seized by the public. Every one of you is empowered to do that and protected by the law to do so. That's why we're inviting the public, and especially the homeless, to come into these churches with us when we begin to seize them this coming week. And that's something you can all do in your own communities. Write to us, Republic National Council at protonmail.com, because we operate under the authority of our own sovereign jurisdiction within the Republic of Canada. Now we're going to be starting these actions this week and in the weeks to come. We'll be using those liberated zones in those churches to hold court and to prosecute the men who killed our friends. People like RCMP officer Peter Montague and United Church official Gary Patterson and Catholic Archbishop Michael Miller, all of whom arranged the murder of Harriet Nahani and Billy Coombs and Bingo Dawson after we began our church occupations in Vancouver in 2007 and 8. And our Indigenous allies and their warriors are going to help us in arresting these people, as they've already pledged to as part of their banishment proclamation on June 12th. And that's how we banish the killers and reclaim the law and the land for ourselves. It's time for each one of you to move from talk into action. Once you take the first step to do so, you'll discover how weak our enemy is, for they know their guilt and they live in fear, and that makes them very vulnerable and easy to provoke. We have the law and the public on our side, and often the police on our side. It's simply a matter of taking action now, at this critical moment. The world is ours. Now is a chance for you to reclaim it by joining us, because if you fail to do so, you'll have no one to blame but yourselves for what will befall you. Well, soon after the military coup in Chile, a slogan appeared on the walls of Santiago and in the burned out factories that had been seized and run by the workers themselves. That slogan said, "We don't want money, we don't want power, we want a new world." It's within our power to create such a world, but only once we join the fight for it. I was taught that sacred lesson as a boy of 17, and it has never left me. May you learn it too, by joining our revolution now and stopping the killers while you still can. This is Kevin Anning, Eagle Strong Voice. Remember, take action. Contact us, Republic National Council at protonmail.com, republicofcanada.org, murderbydecree.com. Stand by for more.